December 1944. The Western Front. Two of the most famous Allied generals are locked in a bitter rivalry that threatens to tear apart the Allied command structure. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and American General George S. Patton despise each other with a passion that goes beyond professional disagreement. It's personal. It's toxic. And it's about to explode into a crisis that reaches the highest levels of Allied leadership. Montgomery, meticulous and cautious, considers Patton a reckless cowboy who wastes lives through aggressive attacks. Patton, bold and relentless, sees Montgomery as an overcautious prima donna who moves too slowly and lets enemies escape. Their mutual contempt has been building for 2 years, since North Africa, through Sicily, and now across France and into Germany. But what's coming will make previous clashes look like gentlemanly disagreements. Montgomery is about to demand something unprecedented: Patton's removal from command, his court-martial, and his complete disgrace. And the response he gets will come from an unexpected source and will shock everyone who hears it. To understand this crisis, you need to understand Bernard Law Montgomery. Born in 1887, Monty is Britain's most famous general. He defeated Rommel at El Alamein in 1942, the first major British victory against Germany. Churchill said of that battle, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." Montgomery became a national hero overnight. But fame went to his head. By 1944, Montgomery is insufferable. He's arrogant, self-promoting, and convinced of his own genius. He wears 2 badges in his beret when regulations allow 1. He refers to himself in the third person, Montgomery thinks. He gives press conferences where he takes credit for victories while blaming others for setbacks. Worse, he openly criticizes American generals, particularly Eisenhower and Patton. He believes Americans don't understand warfare and need British leadership. His strategy is cautious and methodical. He refuses to attack until overwhelming superiority is achieved. This approach minimizes British casualties, which matters politically because Britain's manpower is exhausted. But it also lets German forces escape to fight again. George Smith Patton Jr. is Montgomery's opposite in almost every way. Born in 1885 to a wealthy California family, Patton is a warrior who believes in aggressive action, speed, and violence of execution. "The way to prevent the enemy from attacking you is to attack him," Patton famously said. His nickname is Old Blood and Guts, though his men joke it's our blood, his guts. Patton's Third Army has torn through France faster than anyone thought possible, liberating territory at a pace that astonishes friend and foe alike. He relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, his army pivoting 90 degrees and attacking in winter conditions that others said made movement impossible. But Patton has 2 fatal flaws. First, his mouth. He says outrageous things that create diplomatic incidents. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily, nearly ending his career. He made comments about Soviets that infuriated allies. Second, his contempt for caution. He takes risks that cost lives but win battles. This terrifies cautious commanders like Montgomery. The Montgomery-Patton feud began in Sicily, July 1943. The island invasion was supposed to showcase Allied cooperation. Instead it became a race, literally. Montgomery commanded British 8th Army on the eastern side. Patton commanded U.S. 7th Army on the western side. The objective was Messina, the key port at the island's northeast tip. Montgomery's plan was methodical: advance slowly up the east coast, overwhelming German defenses with superior force. Patton's plan was aggressive: race up the west coast and beat Montgomery to Messina. The race was on. And it got ugly. Montgomery, used to being the star, was shocked when Patton's Americans kept pace, then pulled ahead. Patton, driving his men mercilessly, was determined to beat the British to prove American forces were as good as, or better than, Montgomery's vaunted 8th Army. On August 17, 1943, Patton entered Messina hours before Montgomery arrived. He greeted Montgomery with theatrical courtesy: "It was a horse race, and I won." Montgomery was furious. He'd been upstaged by an American he considered inferior. The humiliation burned. But Sicily gave Montgomery ammunition against Patton. In August 1943, Patton visited field hospitals and encountered shell-shocked soldiers. Patton, who had no sympathy for what he saw as cowardice, slapped 2 soldiers and called them cowards. "You're a disgrace to the army," he shouted at one terrified private. The incidents were reported by medical staff and reached Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander. Eisenhower was appalled but faced a dilemma. Patton was his most aggressive, successful combat commander. Losing him would hurt the war effort. But the slappings were indefensible abuse of soldiers suffering from combat trauma. Eisenhower forced Patton to apologize to the soldiers, the medical staff, and his entire army. It was humiliating. But Eisenhower kept Patton in command, barely. Montgomery saw this differently. To him, the slappings proved Patton was unstable, cruel, and unfit for command. He began a quiet campaign to have Patton removed, writing letters to British commanders and politicians suggesting Americans couldn't control their generals. The feud deepened. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied forces invade Normandy. Montgomery commands all ground forces initially. Patton arrives in July to command Third Army. The contrasting philosophies immediately clash. Montgomery's plan is, colossal crack, build up overwhelming force, then attack with such superiority that success is certain. This takes time. Weeks. The Normandy campaign bogs down. Montgomery captures Caen, his D-Day objective, only after 6 weeks of bitter fighting. Patton's approach is opposite: attack, attack, attack. Don't worry about your flanks. The enemy will worry about his flanks when you're in his rear. Once Third Army breaks out at Avranches in late July, Patton's forces explode across France. In 2 weeks, Third Army advances further than Montgomery has in 2 months. The contrast is stark and embarrassing for Montgomery. British newspapers notice. American newspapers notice. Churchill notices. Montgomery's reputation as the great British general is being overshadowed by an American cowboy. Worse, Patton isn't subtle about it. He gives press interviews highlighting his army's speed. He makes jokes about waiting for Monty to catch up. By September 1944, Allied forces have liberated France and approached the German border. Now comes a strategic debate that will define the Montgomery-Patton feud. Montgomery proposes a single-thrust strategy: give him all available supplies and forces, and he'll drive a narrow corridor through Holland and into Germany's industrial Ruhr region, ending the war by Christmas 1944. Give me the supplies, Montgomery argues, and I can finish this quickly. Patton proposes a broad front strategy: multiple armies attack simultaneously across the German frontier, preventing Germany from concentrating defenses. We can all go forward, Patton argues. Why put all eggs in Monty's slow basket? Eisenhower, the supreme commander, must decide. The debate is also about nationalism. British commanders support Montgomery's plan. American commanders support Patton's approach. Churchill pressures Eisenhower to back Montgomery. Marshall and Roosevelt pressure Eisenhower to back American generals. The decision has military and political dimensions. Across Dutch rivers while ground forces race up a single highway to link up with them, creating a corridor into Germany. It's the largest airborne operation in history. It's also a catastrophic failure. The British 1st Airborne Division is dropped at Arnhem, the furthest bridge. They're supposed to hold it for 2 days until ground forces arrive. But intelligence failures mean the division drops onto 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting in the area. The paratroopers are outnumbered and outgunned. Ground forces can't get through, the single highway becomes a killing zone. After 9 days, the Arnhem force is destroyed. Of 10,000 men, only 2,000 escape. Market Garden fails completely. The war won't end in 1944. Montgomery has gambled and lost. While Montgomery's market garden fails, Patton's Third Army is sitting still. Why? Because Eisenhower diverted Patton's fuel and ammunition to support Montgomery's operation. Patton is furious. His army is on the German frontier, ready to attack, but has no supplies. "I could be in Berlin if they'd give me the gas," Patton rages to his staff. He's not entirely wrong. Third Army has momentum and weak German opposition in their sector. But supplies are limited, there aren't enough trucks to supply everyone. Eisenhower chose to support Montgomery's bold plan over Patton's aggressive pursuit. The result? Montgomery fails spectacularly while Patton sits idle. Patton sees this as vindication of his argument: Montgomery is overcautious and incompetent, Patton should have been supported instead. Montgomery sees it differently: Market Garden failed because he didn't get enough support. If Eisenhower had fully committed to the single thrust instead of compromising, it would have worked. The mutual recriminations intensify. December 16, 1944. Germany launches a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler gambles everything on one last attack to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. American forces are caught off guard and fall back in confusion. By December 19, Eisenhower calls an emergency meeting. The situation looks desperate. German panzers have driven a deep bulge into American lines. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, is surrounded. Montgomery, commanding forces north of the bulge, advocates caution: pull back, establish strong defenses, wait for German attack to exhaust itself. Patton does the opposite. He proposes attacking the German flank immediately. Eisenhower is skeptical: when can you attack? December 22, Patton says. 3 days. Impossible, everyone thinks. Patton's Third Army is currently engaged in offensive operations to the south. Turning an entire army 90 degrees in winter and launching a coordinated attack in 3 days seems impossible. "I'll be there," Patton insists. He is. On December 22, Third Army attacks north into the German flank. Within days, Patton's forces break through to Bastogne. The siege is lifted. The German offensive collapses. Patton's relief of Bastogne is hailed as a brilliant feat of mobile warfare. Churchill calls it the greatest American battle of the war. But Montgomery isn't celebrating. He's scheming. In early January 1945, Montgomery holds a press conference. He's been given temporary command of American forces north of the Bulge during the crisis. At the press conference, Montgomery takes credit for winning the battle. "As soon as I was brought in and the American forces put under my command," Montgomery says smugly, "we sorted out the mess and won the battle." The implication is clear: American generals created the mess, British leadership saved the day. American newspapers and generals are outraged. Patton fumes. "Monty did nothing except sit on his ass while my Third Army fought," Patton tells his staff. Now he takes credit. Bradley, commanding American forces, is equally furious. Even Eisenhower, usually diplomatic, is angry at Montgomery's arrogance. The press conference creates a crisis in Allied unity. British and American commanders are barely speaking. But the real crisis is coming. Late January 1945. Third Army is advancing into Germany. Patton's forces are moving faster than anyone expected, liberating territory and destroying German forces. Montgomery's forces are moving slowly, methodically, in his characteristic style. At a staff meeting, Patton makes a comment that will trigger everything. The exact words vary by account, but the essence is, "Monty is a tired old man who should retire and let real soldiers finish this war." Someone at the meeting, probably British liaison officers, reports this to Montgomery's headquarters. Montgomery is apoplectic. This is the final straw. 2 years of being upstaged, criticized, and insulted by this American cowboy. 2 years of Patton's army moving faster, getting more press, achieving more dramatic victories. 2 years of humiliation. Montgomery decides, Patton must go. Not just criticized. Not just reprimanded. Removed from command. Court-martialed. Destroyed. Montgomery drafts a letter to Eisenhower. It's unprecedented in its bluntness. General Patton's conduct has become intolerable. His insubordination, his public criticism of Allied commanders, his reckless operations that waste lives, these cannot continue. I formally request that General Patton be relieved of command immediately, court-martialed for insubordination, and removed from the European theater. If this is not done, I must reconsider my position in this command structure. It's an ultimatum. Remove Patton or I resign. Montgomery sends copies to Churchill, to the British Chiefs of Staff, and to Field Marshal Alan Brooke. He's going over Eisenhower's head, using political pressure. The letter creates panic at Supreme Headquarters. Eisenhower is furious but trapped. Montgomery is Britain's most famous general. Churchill supports him. British public opinion venerates him. But Patton is America's most successful combat commander. Removing him would outrage American press and public. Marshall supports him. It's a political nightmare with no good solution. Eisenhower needs time to figure out how to respond without breaking the alliance. Eisenhower faces an impossible choice. Fire Patton, this would placate Montgomery and the British. But it would enrage American commanders, press, and public. Patton hasn't technically done anything court-martial worthy. Insulting Montgomery isn't a military crime. Marshall and Roosevelt would be furious. Keep Patton, this maintains American commander support. But Montgomery might resign, creating a massive political crisis. Churchill would be furious. The British press would accuse Americans of not taking British concerns seriously. The alliance could fracture. Eisenhower tries to split the difference. He summons Patton and reprimands him privately, warning him to stop criticizing Montgomery publicly. He writes to Montgomery promising to keep Patton under control. But Montgomery isn't satisfied. He wants Patton gone, not reprimanded. The crisis deepens. Churchill gets involved, pressuring Roosevelt. British newspapers run stories suggesting American generals are insubordinate. American newspapers respond with stories criticizing Montgomery's slowness. It's becoming a public transatlantic fight. That's when someone unexpected intervenes. Douglas MacArthur. He's in the Pacific, commanding Allied forces against Japan. He's not involved in the European theater. He has no official role in this dispute. But MacArthur is one of America's most famous generals, a 5-star general like Eisenhower. More importantly, he has Roosevelt's ear and commands immense public respect. When news of Montgomery's demand reaches Washington, Marshall briefs MacArthur during a visit to Manila. Marshall is furious about British pressure to fire Patton. They want us to court-martial our best combat commander because Montgomery's feelings are hurt, Marshall fumes. MacArthur listens. Then he does something no one expects. He writes a letter. Not to Eisenhower. Not to Montgomery. To Churchill directly. MacArthur and Churchill know each other from World War I. They respect each other despite disagreements. MacArthur's letter is masterly, respectful to Churchill while defending Patton and putting Montgomery in his place. MacArthur's intervention will change everything. The letter, dated February 10, 1945, begins, Dear Prime Minister, I write to you as a fellow servant of our democratic nations and as one who has fought alongside British forces with great admiration for their courage and sacrifice. I understand there is some difficulty in the European theater regarding General Patton and Field Marshal Montgomery. Though I command in a different theater, I feel compelled to share my perspective as someone who has worked with officers of both our nations. The opening is diplomatic, respectful. Then MacArthur gets to his point. I have known George Patton for 30 years. We served together in Mexico, in France in the Great War, and I have watched his career with professional interest. Is he difficult? Yes. Is he outspoken? Absolutely. Does he sometimes say things that create diplomatic headaches? Without question. But here is what else George Patton is: he is the finest operational commander in the Allied armies in Europe. His Third Army has liberated more French territory, destroyed more German forces, and advanced further faster than any other Allied army, British or American. MacArthur continues, "You ask, correctly, what should be done about officers who cannot work together harmoniously. This is a valid question. But let me pose another: what should be done about officers who win battles versus officers who avoid them? General Patton fights. He attacks. He destroys the enemy. These are, I believe, the purposes for which we employ generals in wartime. Field Marshal Montgomery is a careful, methodical commander who has achieved victories through superior preparation and overwhelming force. I do not criticize this approach; it has its merits, particularly for a nation whose manpower reserves are as stretched as Britain's. But let us be honest about what we're discussing. Field Marshal Montgomery wants General Patton removed not because Patton is incompetent, but because Patton's successes highlight the contrast between their approaches. This is professional jealousy dressed up as concern for command harmony. This is explosive. MacArthur is accusing Montgomery of petty jealousy. To Churchill. Directly. MacArthur's letter becomes even more pointed. I have read Field Marshal Montgomery's press conference statements following the Ardennes battle. With respect, they were inappropriate. Montgomery took credit for American successes while commanding American forces temporarily. This created the very discord he now complains about. If we're discussing officers whose statements damage Allied harmony, perhaps we should start with Montgomery's press conferences rather than Patton's private comments. MacArthur is turning the tables. Montgomery's public statements were worse than Patton's private grumbling. Then MacArthur makes a comparison that will infuriate Montgomery. In the Pacific, I work with Australian, New Zealand, Dutch, and Philippine commanders. We have disagreements. We have different approaches. But we do not demand each other's court-martial when those disagreements become heated. We focus on defeating Japan. Perhaps the European theater could adopt a similar focus on defeating Germany rather than on resolving personality conflicts. MacArthur then makes his central argument: if Field Marshal Montgomery cannot work with General Patton, there is a simple solution that does not require court-martialing America's most successful combat commander: assign them to different sectors. Montgomery commands in the north. Patton commands in the south. They need not coordinate closely. This preserves both men's abilities to contribute to victory without requiring daily interaction. But removing Patton, court-martialing him, destroying his career because Montgomery finds him personally disagreeable? That would be a catastrophic waste of military talent for the sake of one man's ego. And it would send a message to American forces and the American public that British generals have veto power over American commanders. I do not believe this is a message you wish to send, Prime Minister. MacArthur is threatening consequences: fire Patton and damage Anglo-American relations. The implication is clear: American public opinion will not tolerate sacrificing Patton to British demands. MacArthur closes with devastating politeness: I have the utmost respect for British arms and British leadership. But I also recognize that this war will be won by commanders who fight, not by commanders who maneuver for personal advancement. General Patton fights. Whatever his personal failings, and he has many, he destroys German armies efficiently and rapidly. That is what we need from generals in 1945 as we close in on final victory. I urge you to consider whether removing such a commander serves the Allied cause or merely Field Marshal Montgomery's amour propre. I remain, with great respect, your obedient servant, Douglas MacArthur, General of the Army. The letter is a masterpiece of diplomatic knife-fighting. It respects Churchill while destroying Montgomery's case. It threatens political consequences while maintaining courteous tone. Most importantly, it comes from MacArthur, a general Churchill respects, who has no stake in the European theater, offering an outsider's perspective. Churchill is impressed despite himself. Churchill receives MacArthur's letter on February 15, 1945. He reads it twice. Then he summons his military secretary and asks for Montgomery's file on the Patton matter. After reviewing everything, Montgomery's complaints, Eisenhower's reports, American responses, Churchill reaches a conclusion. Montgomery is wrong. Not about Patton's difficult personality. Patton is difficult, insubordinate, and creates problems. But removing him would be wrong militarily and politically. MacArthur is right, this is professional jealousy. Churchill has seen enough of Montgomery's behavior to recognize it. The press conference taking credit for the Bulge victory particularly bothered Churchill. It was ungracious and politically stupid. Now Montgomery wants Patton court-martialed for saying mean things about him. While Third Army is driving into Germany at record pace. Churchill writes to Montgomery directly, Field Marshal, I have received your request regarding General Patton. I have also consulted with military advisors and considered the matter carefully. I must decline to support your request for General Patton's removal. Churchill's letter continues, General Patton is, without question, a difficult subordinate. His statements are often inappropriate and his contempt for other commanders is unprofessional. However, his military results speak for themselves. Third Army has performed brilliantly throughout the campaign. While I understand your frustration with his behavior, I cannot support removing a commander who is winning battles merely because his personality is disagreeable. Furthermore, and I must be frank with you, your own recent statements, particularly your press conference following the Ardennes battle, have created as much diplomatic difficulty as Patton's private grumbling. If we are to maintain standards of appropriate behavior for senior commanders, those standards must apply equally to all. I suggest that you and General Patton maintain professional courtesy, coordinate militarily as required, but otherwise avoid unnecessary interaction. The war is nearly won. Let us not fracture the alliance over personality conflicts in the final months. With respect and confidence in your continued excellent service, Winston Churchill. Montgomery is devastated. Churchill, his political patron, has sided against him. Not only that, but Churchill criticized his own behavior in the process. For a proud man like Montgomery, this is humiliating beyond words. He considers resigning. But resigning would be admitting defeat. It would validate every criticism Patton and others have made, that Montgomery is vain, petty, and more concerned with personal glory than winning battles. After sleepless nights, Montgomery decides to stay but withdraws into cold professionalism. He stops trying to get Patton fired. He stops public criticism. He focuses on his Northern Army's advance into Germany. But the humiliation burns. And everyone knows MacArthur's letter was the turning point. Word spreads through Allied headquarters, MacArthur defended Patton to Churchill, and Churchill backed down. Officers debate the letter's contents, few have seen it, but rumors spread. MacArthur told Churchill that Montgomery was jealous. MacArthur said removing Patton would damage the alliance. The details vary, but the message is clear. An American general defended another American general against British pressure, and won. Patton learns about MacArthur's intervention through Marshall, who writes to him, General MacArthur has written to Prime Minister Churchill regarding Montgomery's demands for your removal. I cannot share the letter's contents, but I can tell you that MacArthur's intervention was decisive in resolving the matter favorably. You remain in command. Continue the excellent work Third Army is doing. Patton is surprised and grateful. He and MacArthur have never been close friends. They're both alpha males, both supremely confident, both difficult subordinates. But MacArthur defended him when it mattered. Patton writes a thank you note to MacArthur, Dear Douglas, I understand you spoke on my behalf regarding recent difficulties with British command. I am grateful for your support and hope someday to repay the favor. In the meantime, I will endeavor to control my mouth better, though you know that's always been my weak point. With respect and gratitude, George. MacArthur writes back, briefly, George, win battles. That's the only thanks I need. Douglas. This exchange between two legendary generals becomes part of their shared history. Eisenhower has mixed feelings about MacArthur's intervention. Relief, the crisis is resolved. Montgomery has backed down. Patton stays in command. The alliance holds. War continues toward victory. But also resentment. MacArthur interfered in Eisenhower's theater. Ike is supreme commander in Europe, this was his problem to solve. MacArthur had no business writing to Churchill about European theater matters. It's overstepping. Moreover, it makes Eisenhower look weak. He couldn't handle his own subordinates, so MacArthur from the Pacific had to intervene. That's embarrassing. Eisenhower writes a carefully worded letter to MacArthur, "Thank you for your assistance in resolving recent command difficulties. Your perspective was valuable. However, I trust future matters within the European theater can be handled through established command channels." Translation: Thanks, but stay out of my theater. MacArthur's reply is equally careful, of course. I would never presume to interfere in your command. I merely offered a friend's perspective when asked for advice by the Chief of Staff. Translation: Marshall asked me to help, so I did. The exchange is polite but tense. The relationship between Eisenhower and MacArthur, never warm, becomes cooler. By late February 1945, British newspapers get wind of the Montgomery-Patton crisis and MacArthur's intervention. The stories are partial and inaccurate, no one has seen MacArthur's actual letter, but the general outline is correct. MacArthur defends Patton against Monty, headlines scream. American general in Pacific intervenes in European command dispute, the British press divides. Conservative papers that support Churchill defend his decision to back MacArthur's position, Churchill right to reject Montgomery's demands, they editorialize. Papers sympathetic to Montgomery attack the decision, British general undermined by American politics, they complain. The story becomes a minor scandal, embarrassing for Montgomery and uncomfortable for Churchill. Questions are asked in Parliament. Why did an American general in the Pacific have more influence over European strategy than Britain's most successful field marshal? Churchill deflects. General MacArthur offered advice when consulted. I weighed all perspectives and made the decision I believed best served the alliance and victory. American newspapers, in contrast, celebrate the story. MacArthur saves Patton from British backstabbing, headlines crow. Pacific general defends European hero, the story feeds into existing American resentment about Montgomery's arrogance and his post-Bulge press conference. MacArthur showed those Brits that Americans stand together, editorial pages declare. Montgomery wanted to court-martial our best general because his feelings were hurt. Thank God MacArthur stood up for our guys. The coverage is jingoistic and simplifies a complex situation, but it resonates with American public opinion. Patton's reputation is enhanced. He's the underdog general that even MacArthur defended. MacArthur's reputation is enhanced. He's the wise elder statesman who resolved a crisis through diplomacy. Montgomery's reputation suffers. He's portrayed as petty and jealous. Churchill comes out okay, he's seen as reasonable for backing MacArthur's position. The person who benefits most from this entire affair is George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Marshall orchestrated MacArthur's intervention. When British pressure mounted to fire Patton, Marshall knew direct American resistance would escalate the crisis. But having MacArthur, a respected outsider with no direct stake, weigh in. That was brilliant. MacArthur had credibility Churchill respected. MacArthur had stature equal to Montgomery's. MacArthur could say things that Marshall or Eisenhower couldn't without seeming self-serving. Marshall knew this. He briefed MacArthur carefully on the situation, knew MacArthur would respond forcefully, and knew Churchill would listen. When MacArthur's letter did exactly what Marshall hoped, convinced Churchill to back down, Marshall had achieved his objective without direct confrontation. This is Marshall at his best, strategic thinking applied to politics as well as war. He protected an American general from British political pressure while preserving the alliance. Brilliant. Montgomery never forgives this humiliation. For the rest of his life, he nurses resentment toward Patton, MacArthur, and to some extent Churchill. In his memoirs, published in 1958, Montgomery settles scores. He describes Patton as a thruster who got his army into trouble through overambition. He describes MacArthur as a general who never understood European warfare. These are petty jabs from a man who never got over being told no. Montgomery also rewrites history, claiming his cautious approach was strategically superior and that Patton's aggressive style wasted lives unnecessarily. Military historians debate this. The truth is both approaches had merits and flaws. But Montgomery's need to justify himself, to prove he was right and they were wrong, reveals how much the 1945 humiliation affected him. He wanted Patton's head. He demanded it. He was refused. And MacArthur's intervention was the turning point. Montgomery could never accept that. Patton dies in December 1945, just months after the war ends, from injuries in a car accident in Germany. At his funeral, Montgomery sends a wreath with a card, "A great soldier." It's gracious, appropriate. But also strategic. Patton is dead. Montgomery outlives his rival. In death, Patton can't contradict Montgomery's memoirs or challenge his version of events. Some historians suggest Montgomery's post-war writings are his revenge, rewriting history when Patton can't respond. But Montgomery never mentions MacArthur's letter in his memoirs. Perhaps he doesn't want to remind readers of his humiliation. Perhaps he hopes it will be forgotten. It hasn't been. The story of Montgomery demanding Patton's head and MacArthur's shocking reply has become part of World War II lore, a reminder that sometimes the biggest battles are fought in headquarters rather than on battlefields. Why did MacArthur intervene? Several theories exist. Professional solidarity. MacArthur recognized that firing a successful combat commander for personality conflicts set a dangerous precedent. He himself had clashed with superiors. If Patton could be removed for being difficult, MacArthur might be next. Rivalry with Montgomery. MacArthur and Montgomery had met briefly in World War I and disliked each other. MacArthur found Montgomery pompous and overly cautious. Defending Patton gave MacArthur a chance to undermine Montgomery indirectly. Marshall's request. MacArthur was loyal to Marshall and may have intervened simply because Marshall asked. Strategic thinking. MacArthur genuinely believed removing Patton would hurt the war effort and damage American military effectiveness. The truth is probably all of these factors combined. MacArthur was complex, combining genuine strategic insight with personal vanity and professional calculation. Whatever his motives, his intervention worked. Why did Churchill back MacArthur instead of Montgomery? Several reasons. Pragmatism. Churchill recognized that fighting over Patton would damage the alliance without military benefit. Patton was winning battles. Removing him would outrage Americans without helping Britain. Political calculation. Churchill needed American support for Britain's post-war position. Antagonizing American military leadership over a personality conflict wasn't worth it. Frustration with Montgomery. Churchill had grown tired of Montgomery's arrogance and self-promotion. The post-Bulge press conference had embarrassed Churchill politically. Montgomery needed to be reminded he wasn't indispensable. Respect for MacArthur. Churchill genuinely respected MacArthur's military judgment. When MacArthur said Patton was too valuable to lose, Churchill listened. Churchill's decision showed political wisdom. He prioritized alliance cohesion over one general's ego, even when that general was Britain's most famous commander. The Montgomery-Patton crisis occurred within a broader context of Anglo-American tensions in 1944–45, strategy disagreements. Britain favored concentration of force, America favored broad front advances. Command structure. Britain wanted Montgomery as ground forces commander, America wanted Eisenhower in overall command. Post-war planning. Britain and America had different visions for post-war Europe, particularly regarding Soviet influence. Resources. American industrial might increasingly dominated the alliance, reducing British influence. The Patton crisis was a symptom of these larger tensions. Britain's declining influence in the alliance made Montgomery's demands seem like attempts to maintain British prestige rather than military necessity. America's rising dominance made British threats to resign less intimidating. The alliance would survive without Montgomery more easily than it would have survived without Patton. MacArthur's intervention crystallized this power dynamic. American generals could appeal over British commanders' heads and win. Eisenhower managed this crisis, barely, by maintaining coalition unity above all else. His philosophy was, the whole Allied organization is a brittle one. It can be destroyed by a single incident. Eisenhower worked tirelessly to prevent that single incident. He mediated between Montgomery and Patton countless times. He placated Churchill while maintaining American commander support. He balanced British and American sensitivities on every decision. The Montgomery-Patton crisis threatened to become that single incident that broke the alliance. Only MacArthur's intervention prevented it. Eisenhower later wrote, "Managing allies is more difficult than managing enemies. With enemies, you just shoot them. With allies, you must persuade, cajole, compromise, and occasionally deceive them for their own good." The Montgomery-Patton affair tested Eisenhower's diplomatic skills to their limits. Did Patton understand how close he came to losing his command? Yes. Despite his bombastic personality, Patton was politically astute when he wanted to be. He knew Montgomery was gunning for him. He knew his comments created problems. After Marshall's letter informing him of MacArthur's intervention, Patton wrote in his diary, "I came within an inch of losing everything because I couldn't keep my damn mouth shut. Marshall and MacArthur saved me. I owe them. But more importantly, I owe it to my men to win this war quickly. That's the only way I can justify the trouble I cause." For the remaining months of the war, Patton was noticeably more restrained in his public comments, though still aggressive in his operations. He focused on results rather than personality conflicts. Whether this restraint came from gratitude to MacArthur or fear of being removed, it served him well. Third Army's final drive into Germany was spectacular, crossing the Rhine, liberating concentration camps, driving into Czechoslovakia. In his memoirs and post-war speeches, Montgomery suggested an alternative history. If his single-thrust strategy had been fully supported instead of Patton's broad-front approach, the war would have ended in 1944, saving thousands of lives. Political considerations, Montgomery wrote, prevented the implementation of the strategy that would have ended the war quickest. This became Montgomery's justification. He was right militarily but overruled politically because Americans wanted their generals to share glory. Military historians debate this counterfactual. Some support Montgomery's view that a concentrated attack might have succeeded. Others argue that single thrust would have created a dangerously narrow salient vulnerable to counterattack, potentially leading to disaster worse than Market Garden. The debate is unresolvable. We can't rerun history. But Montgomery's insistence on his correctness, decades after the war, suggests he never accepted that others might have valid alternative views. MacArthur rarely discussed his intervention in the Montgomery-Patton crisis publicly. But in private conversations recorded by aides, he made several revealing comments. Montgomery was a good general who became a prima donna. Patton was a prima donna who became a great general. The difference is important. I defended Patton not because I liked him, we weren't close, but because armies need fighters more than they need diplomats. Save diplomacy for peacetime. Churchill understood what Montgomery didn't. Wars are won by men who fight, not by men who maneuver for position. These comments reveal MacArthur's pragmatic view: personality is less important than results. Patton produced results. Montgomery produced excuses. The choice was obvious. MacArthur also understood the political dimension. If we had let the British fire an American general for hurting British feelings, where would it end? Would British commanders have veto power over American appointments? Unacceptable. MacArthur's letter to Churchill is now studied in military academies as an example of effective advocacy, how to defend a subordinate while maintaining respectful tone toward superiors. Alliance management, how to address coalition tensions without breaking the coalition. Strategic communication, how to make arguments that appeal to the recipient's interests rather than your own. Political-military integration, how military leaders must consider political factors in operational decisions. The letter is considered a masterclass in military diplomacy. It achieved its objective, saving Patton, without creating new problems, breaking the alliance or insulting Churchill. Students analyze its structure, opening with respect, building logical argument, addressing counterarguments, closing with appeal to shared interests. The letter shows that sometimes military leadership requires writing skills as much as tactical brilliance. What if Churchill had supported Montgomery's demand and Patton had been fired in February 1945? Several consequences seem likely: military impact. Third Army would have continued under a new commander, probably less aggressively. The final drive into Germany might have been slower, potentially extending the war. Political impact. American public opinion would have been outraged. Congress might have investigated British influence over American commanders. Post-war alliance. Anglo-American relations would have been damaged, potentially affecting NATO formation and Cold War cooperation. Patton's legacy. He would be remembered as a great general destroyed by political persecution, becoming a martyr figure. Montgomery's legacy. He would be seen as petty and vindictive, damaging his own historical reputation. The actual outcome, Patton staying in command, was better for everyone except Montgomery's ego. The Montgomery-Patton crisis illuminates a timeless leadership question: what matters more, character or competence? Montgomery emphasized character. Patton's insubordination, crude behavior, and inability to work collegially disqualified him from high command regardless of results. MacArthur emphasized competence. Patton's battlefield results outweighed his personality flaws. Winning battles was the measure of a general, not popularity or political skill. Modern military leadership tries to balance both. Competence without character leads to toxic commands that achieve short-term results but long-term dysfunction. Character without competence leads to well-liked but ineffective leaders. The ideal is both, competent and professional. But when forced to choose, MacArthur's argument prevailed: in wartime, competence trumps character. Win the war first. Address personality issues later. This remains controversial but reflects military pragmatism. Battles are won by leaders who fight effectively, not by leaders who attend etiquette classes. President Franklin Roosevelt never publicly commented on the Montgomery-Patton crisis. But privately, he supported Marshall's handling and MacArthur's intervention. Roosevelt understood the political dimensions. Britain was a crucial ally, but American public opinion wouldn't tolerate sacrificing American generals to British demands. Churchill was Roosevelt's friend and partner, but Montgomery wasn't Churchill. Roosevelt felt no loyalty to protect Montgomery's feelings. Roosevelt sent a brief message to Marshall: your handling of recent command difficulties was excellent. Maintaining alliance cohesion while protecting American command prerogatives is exactly right. To Churchill, Roosevelt wrote nothing specific about the crisis but included in a broader letter: I am confident that our military leaders will resolve their differences and focus on the common enemy. Personal animosities must not distract from our shared objective. Diplomatic silence that communicated Roosevelt's position: handle this quietly, don't break the alliance, but don't sacrifice American interests either. Soviet leaders watched the Montgomery-Patton crisis with interest and amusement. Stalin saw Western alliance tensions as opportunities to exploit. Soviet propaganda highlighted the crisis as evidence of Western disunity. While Soviet armies liberate Eastern Europe through unified command, capitalist allies bicker over personal glory. Privately, Soviet generals had a different take. Marshal Zhukov, when briefed on the crisis, reportedly said, Patton fights like a Russian general, aggressive, fast, results-oriented. Montgomery fights like a bureaucrat, careful, political, slow. Of course the Americans kept Patton. They're not fools. Soviet military doctrine favored aggressive action and accepted casualties to achieve objectives quickly. From that perspective, Patton's approach made more sense than Montgomery's caution. The crisis also confirmed Soviet assessments of Western command structure as fractured and inefficient compared to Soviet centralized control. This influenced post-war planning and Cold War strategies. German intelligence monitored Allied command tensions closely, hoping to exploit divisions. When word of the Montgomery-Patton crisis leaked, German intelligence reported to Hitler, enemy coalition shows increasing strain. British and American commanders openly hostile. Possibility exists of exploiting these divisions through propaganda and strategic maneuver. Hitler, increasingly delusional by February 1945, seized on this: the alliance will collapse. The British and Americans will turn on each other. German propaganda broadcasts highlighted the crisis, exaggerating tensions and predicting imminent Allied collapse. But German military leaders were more realistic. Field Marshal Kesselring, commanding in the West, noted, Allied command disputes are irrelevant. They have overwhelming material superiority. Whether led by quarrelsome generals or harmonious ones, they will defeat us. The Montgomery-Patton crisis gave Germans brief hope but changed nothing militarily. The war was lost regardless of Allied personality conflicts. After the war, Montgomery and Patton's careers diverged dramatically. Montgomery, promoted to Field Marshal, Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. Served as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, then Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO. Retired in 1958, died in 1976 at age 88. Spent decades justifying his wartime decisions in memoirs and interviews. Patton, died December 1945 in a car accident at age 60. Never had a chance to write memoirs or defend his reputation. Became a legendary figure, subject of films, books, and mythologizing. The contrast is stark. Montgomery lived another 31 years but spent much of that time arguing about his wartime record. Patton died young but became a legend, frozen in time at the peak of his glory. Which had the better legacy? Historians debate, but popular memory clearly favors Patton, the warrior who died with his reputation intact rather than the survivor who spent decades explaining himself. Ironically, MacArthur would later experience what Patton faced, a superior demanding his removal for insubordination. In April 1951, President Truman fired MacArthur for publicly criticizing administration policy during the Korean War. MacArthur had wanted to expand the war into China, Truman wanted limited war. MacArthur made his disagreements public, challenging civilian authority. Truman had no choice but to fire him. When this happened, some observers noted the parallel. MacArthur had defended Patton's right to speak his mind and remain in command in 1945. But when MacArthur himself challenged his superiors in 1951, he was fired. Did MacArthur see the irony? Did he remember defending Patton for insubordination? We don't know. MacArthur never publicly connected the two incidents. But the lesson is clear: there are limits to how far military officers can go in challenging their superiors, and MacArthur found those limits in 1951 just as Patton had approached them in 1945. In his post-war writings, Churchill assessed the Montgomery-Patton crisis with characteristic balance. Montgomery was Britain's most successful general, but success made him insufferably proud. Patton was America's most aggressive general, but aggression made him insufferably reckless. Managing these two prima donnas required constant attention and occasional ruthlessness. When Montgomery demanded Patton's head, I had to choose between British pride and alliance necessity. I chose the alliance. MacArthur's intervention made that choice easier by providing an American voice of authority supporting the decision I had already reached. History, I believe, will judge this correct. Patton's continued command contributed to Germany's rapid defeat. Montgomery's pride recovered. The alliance held. All's well that ends well, though at the time, it seemed we might fracture over two generals' inability to be civil to each other. Churchill's retrospective wisdom makes it sound simple. It wasn't. But his decision to back MacArthur's position was, in hindsight, clearly right. What lessons does the Montgomery-Patton crisis teach modern military leaders? First, competence matters more than personality in combat roles. Results should be the primary evaluation criterion. Second, coalition warfare requires diplomatic skills as much as tactical brilliance. Commanders must manage allies, not just enemies. Third, personal feuds can threaten mission success. Leaders must either reconcile or be separated to prevent their conflicts from damaging the organization. Fourth, sometimes defending difficult subordinates is necessary when their value outweighs their difficulties. Good leaders protect valuable personnel from political attacks. Fifth, outside perspectives can resolve internal conflicts. MacArthur's intervention worked partly because he had no direct stake in the outcome. Sixth, alliance cohesion requires both partners to compromise. Britain couldn't demand American generals be fired, America couldn't ignore British concerns entirely. These lessons remain relevant in modern coalition operations, from NATO to various international partnerships. The Montgomery-Patton crisis took a personal toll on everyone involved. Montgomery, humiliated by Churchill's rejection, Montgomery's confidence was shaken. He remained effective but never regained the supreme self-assurance that characterized his earlier career. Patton, knowing he'd nearly been fired, Patton was more cautious in his public statements. This self-censorship frustrated him but was necessary for survival. Eisenhower, caught between two difficult subordinates and their political patrons, Eisenhower aged visibly during this period. The stress of managing coalition tensions contributed to his post-war exhaustion. Churchill, forced to choose between a British general and alliance cohesion, Churchill made the right choice but strained his relationship with Montgomery. MacArthur, his intervention was effective but created resentment from Eisenhower, complicating inter-theater cooperation. Marshall, successfully orchestrated the resolution but spent political capital managing British sensitivities. The crisis had no winners, only varying degrees of damage limitation. Everyone involved paid a price for two generals' inability to work together. 75 years later, historians still debate who was right in the Montgomery-Patton feud. Pro-Montgomery arguments, his cautious approach minimized British casualties, which mattered for a nation whose manpower was exhausted. His single-thrust strategy might have ended the war earlier if fully supported. His professionalism and discipline were more appropriate for high command than Patton's recklessness. Pro-Patton arguments, his aggressive approach won battles faster and liberated territory more rapidly than Montgomery's caution. His Third Army's record speaks for itself. No other Allied army accomplished more in the war's final year. His personality flaws were outweighed by his battlefield brilliance. The truth? Both were brilliant in different ways. Montgomery was the better defensive tactician and operational planner. Patton was the better offensive commander and exploiter of breakthroughs. The Allies needed both. The tragedy was that their personalities prevented them from complementing each other's strengths. Historians who have studied MacArthur's letter to Churchill identify several sophisticated rhetorical techniques. Establishing credibility, MacArthur opens by emphasizing his friendship with Churchill and respect for British forces, building goodwill before making his argument. Framing the question, he reframes the issue from Patton's insubordination to using our best combat commanders effectively, changing the terms of debate. Turning the tables, he points out Montgomery's own problematic statements, suggesting the British general is guilty of what Patton is accused of. Appeal to practicality, he offers a simple solution, separate commands, that avoids difficult decisions while achieving the objective. Warning of consequences, he implies firing Patton would damage American public opinion and alliance relations without stating this as a threat. Flattering closure, he ends with deference to Churchill's wisdom, making it easy for Churchill to agree while feeling he made the decision independently. These techniques made MacArthur's letter devastatingly effective. Churchill could agree with MacArthur's position while maintaining his own authority and dignity. It was a masterclass in persuasive writing. Media coverage played a crucial role in the Montgomery-Patton crisis. British press initially supported Montgomery but became critical when details emerged about his post-Bulge press conference and demands to fire Patton. British public opinion valued alliance cohesion over Montgomery's ego. American press, strongly supported Patton and criticized Montgomery as arrogant and overrated. American public opinion would have been outraged by Patton's removal. Both governments tried to manage press coverage to prevent the crisis from escalating into public transatlantic conflict. Neither wanted newspaper wars between London and Washington. The press created pressure on both sides. Montgomery couldn't get Patton fired without creating a media storm, but Patton couldn't be too outrageous without giving Montgomery ammunition. This media pressure helped contain the crisis. Both sides knew that going too far would create public relations disasters. MacArthur understood this dynamic and used it. His letter to Churchill acknowledged that firing Patton would create American public backlash, giving Churchill political cover to refuse Montgomery's demand. The Montgomery-Patton crisis illustrates an eternal military problem. Great generals are often difficult personalities. History is filled with brilliant commanders who were nightmares to work with: Napoleon, genius general, impossible ego, alienated allies and subordinates. Grant, brilliant strategist, difficult personality, drinking problems. Rommel, tactical genius, insubordinate, ignored orders when he disagreed. Zhukov, Soviet hero, brutal personality, contemptuous of casualties. Why? Perhaps because the same qualities that make great generals, supreme confidence, aggressive instinct, willingness to take risks, also make them difficult to manage. Montgomery and Patton both had these qualities in abundance. The question for military organizations is, how do you harness difficult genius without being destroyed by it? Eisenhower's answer was constant management, mediation, and separation when necessary. MacArthur's answer was protecting valuable commanders from political attacks while accepting their flaws. Marshall's answer was matching generals to appropriate commands where their strengths were maximized and weaknesses minimized. All three approaches have merit. The key is recognizing that difficult genius may be better than pleasant mediocrity, but only if managed carefully. The Montgomery-Patton crisis occurred in a specific strategic context that affected its resolution. February 1945, the war was clearly won. Germany was collapsing. The question was how quickly, not whether, the Allies would win. This context made the crisis both more and less serious, more serious because, with victory near, political considerations about post-war influence became important. Britain wanted Montgomery to share in victory glory to maintain British prestige. America wanted American generals to receive credit for American contributions. Less serious because, the war's outcome didn't depend on Patton specifically. Any competent general could have commanded Third Army in the final months. Firing Patton wouldn't have cost the war, just delayed victory slightly. This strategic context gave Churchill room to back MacArthur's position. Yes, Montgomery was important, but the alliance was more important, and the war would be won regardless. In earlier, more desperate times, say, 1942 when Britain stood alone, Churchill might have defended Montgomery more forcefully. But by 1945, alliance cohesion mattered more than one general's ego. The military institutions of both nations learned from the Montgomery-Patton crisis. U.S. Army developed better systems for managing difficult personalities in high command. Marshall implemented mentorship programs where successful commanders coached promising but difficult junior officers. British Army created clearer protocols for coalition command structures, reducing ambiguity about authority and reporting relationships. Both armies emphasized joint training and coalition exercises to build working relationships before crises emerge. NATO formation, the experience influenced how NATO structured its command, with clear American Supreme Command but British deputy commanders, balancing national sensitivities. These institutional responses didn't prevent all future personality conflicts, those are inevitable, but provided better frameworks for managing them before they escalate to crisis levels. The Montgomery-Patton affair became a case study in what not to do. Don't let personal feuds fester until they require intervention from the highest political levels. Montgomery and Patton shared many characteristics despite their mutual hatred. Both were supremely confident in their own abilities and contemptuous of others they deemed inferior. Both craved public recognition and carefully cultivated media relationships. Both believed they deserved more authority and were being held back by timid superiors. Both were difficult subordinates who questioned orders and complained about being insufficiently supported. Both were brilliant in their own ways but had significant blind spots. The key differences: Montgomery was cautious, Patton was aggressive. Montgomery was methodical, Patton was instinctive. Montgomery planned carefully, Patton improvised brilliantly. Montgomery minimized casualties, Patton accepted casualties to achieve objectives. These differences made them complementary, if they could have worked together. But their shared arrogance prevented collaboration. Each thought he should command the other, neither was willing to defer, and the result was toxic rivalry that required constant management from superiors. Patton's private opinions of Montgomery, recorded in his diary and letters, were scathing. Montgomery is a tired old man, afraid to fight. He sits and waits for overwhelming superiority, then claims genius when he wins. My dog could win battles with the resources Monty wastes. Monty's problem is he thinks war is about not losing rather than winning. He's conquered by fear of casualties and fear of failure. Real generals embrace risk. If Monty had been commanding Third Army, we'd still be in France. Thank God I don't have to operate under British caution. But Patton also occasionally acknowledged Montgomery's abilities. I hate the son of a bitch, but he's no fool. His set-piece battles are well planned. He just needs to move faster and take more risks. These private thoughts show Patton's conflicted view, professional respect for Montgomery's capabilities mixed with contempt for his personality and approach. Montgomery's opinions of Patton, expressed privately and later in memoirs, were equally harsh. Patton is a thruster without subtlety. He achieves local successes through recklessness but creates strategic problems through lack of planning. American generals like Patton don't understand the art of war. They substitute violence for intelligence and waste resources through poor planning. If Patton had been commanding 21st Army Group, his recklessness would have created disasters. He benefits from commanding American forces with unlimited resources. But Montgomery also occasionally acknowledged Patton's success. I cannot deny that Patton achieves results. His Third Army's advance was remarkable, even if achieved through methods I would never employ. These comments reveal Montgomery's grudging respect for Patton's achievements mixed with certainty that his own approach was superior. What made the Montgomery-Patton rivalry so intense? Psychology offers insights. Narcissism. Both men had narcissistic personalities requiring constant validation and recognition. Neither could tolerate being upstaged. Professional jealousy. Each saw the other's successes as diminishing his own reputation. In their zero-sum thinking, Montgomery's caution made Patton look reckless, Patton's speed made Montgomery look slow. National pride. The rivalry became proxy for Anglo-American tensions about which nation contributed more to victory. Cultural differences. British military culture valued planning and caution, American military culture valued initiative and aggression. Their clash reflected deeper cultural differences. Personal insecurity. Despite outward confidence, both had deep insecurities. Montgomery never forgot being poor as a child. Patton struggled with dyslexia and feared being seen as stupid. These insecurities made them hypersensitive to criticism. Understanding these psychological factors doesn't excuse their behavior but explains it. Two brilliant but insecure men competed for recognition in ways that damaged the alliance they served. How did Eisenhower manage these two difficult subordinates for so long? Several techniques. Separation kept Montgomery and Patton in different sectors, minimizing required interaction. Flattery praised both men constantly, feeding their egos enough to maintain cooperation. Mediation personally intervened in every dispute, preventing escalation. Political cover protected both from their own country's political pressures, allowing them to focus on military operations. Clear authority maintained final decision authority, preventing either from overruling the other. Patience tolerated behavior from both that would have gotten junior officers fired, recognizing their military value outweighed their difficulties. Eisenhower's approach was exhausting but effective. He kept the alliance together and the war moving toward victory despite managing two subordinates who hated each other. This was Eisenhower's genius, not as a tactical commander but as a political military leader who could manage impossibly difficult personalities toward common goals. Did Montgomery and Patton ever reconcile? No. They met one final time at a victory celebration in Berlin, June 1945. The encounter was brief and chilly. Montgomery, congratulations on Third Army's successful campaign. Patton, thank you. Your northern forces also performed adequately. Montgomery, I trust we can put aside past difficulties in light of our shared victory. Patton, sure. As long as you understand my army beat yours to every objective. The exchange was witnessed by several officers who described it as painful to watch. Two great generals who should have celebrated victory together instead traded passive-aggressive insults. Eisenhower separated them quickly, preventing further confrontation. After that meeting, they never saw each other again. Patton died 6 months later. Montgomery lived another 31 years. The tragedy of their relationship is that they were both brilliant but couldn't see past their own egos to appreciate each other's contributions. MacArthur's intervention in the Montgomery-Patton crisis reflected his broader philosophy of command: protect effective subordinates. The commander's duty is to shield his men from political attacks and allow them to focus on their mission. Value results over personality. I don't care if an officer is liked. I care if he wins battles. Resist political interference in military decisions. Politicians should set objectives, generals should determine how to achieve them without political micromanagement. Support fellow professionals. Officers must stand together against those who would sacrifice military effectiveness for political convenience. This philosophy sometimes got MacArthur in trouble. His own confrontations with civilian authority led to his firing in 1951. But it also made him willing to defend Patton when others wouldn't. MacArthur believed that great generals are rare and should be protected, their difficult personalities tolerated in exchange for their battlefield brilliance. This view is controversial but has historical support. Many of history's greatest generals were difficult personalities. MacArthur's letter to Churchill was only 2 pages, roughly 800 words. Yet those 800 words resolved a crisis that threatened to fracture the Allied coalition. What made it so effective? Timing, sent at the exact moment when Churchill was deciding whether to support Montgomery's demand. Authority, coming from a 5-star general with no stake in the European theater, made it harder to dismiss as American self-interest. Respect, despite arguing against Montgomery, the letter never insulted Churchill or questioned his judgment. Logic, the arguments were rational and addressed Churchill's interests, not just American interests. Warning, subtle implications about American public reaction gave Churchill political cover to refuse Montgomery. The letter became a template studied in military and diplomatic academies: how to advocate effectively without damaging relationships or escalating conflicts. Modern officers study it as an example of written communication that achieves strategic objectives through careful crafting and perfect timing. Historians debate the counterfactual: what if Churchill had supported Montgomery and Patton had been fired? Military consequences: Third Army would have continued under new command, probably Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. The final campaign would have proceeded but possibly more slowly. Germany still would have been defeated, perhaps weeks later. Political consequences: American public outrage would have been intense. Congress would have investigated. Anglo-American relations would have been damaged, possibly affecting post-war cooperation. Patton's legacy: he would be remembered as a martyr, destroyed by British jealousy. His reputation might actually have been enhanced by political persecution. Montgomery's legacy: he would be seen as petty and vindictive, permanently damaging his historical reputation. Cold War implications: damaged Anglo-American relations might have affected NATO formation and early Cold War cooperation against Soviet expansion. The actual outcome, keeping Patton in command, was better for everyone except Montgomery's ego. History vindicated MacArthur's intervention. Interestingly, the Red Army experienced similar personality conflicts between Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konyev. Like Montgomery and Patton, both were brilliant but competitive generals who clashed over strategy and credit for victories. Stalin managed them differently than Eisenhower managed Montgomery and Patton. Stalin deliberately fostered rivalry, believing competition produced better results. Stalin used the NKVD to monitor both, ensuring neither became too powerful or independent. Stalin arbitrarily shifted resources between them, preventing either from achieving decisive victories that might enhance political standing. When either complained about the other, Stalin dismissed complaints and ordered them to focus on fighting Germans. This approach was brutal but effective in the Soviet system. Would it have worked with Montgomery and Patton? Probably not. Democratic systems can't use secret police to control generals. But it shows alternative approaches to managing difficult personalities. The Montgomery-Patton crisis occurred within democratic constraints that limited Eisenhower's options compared to Stalin's authoritarian control. How the Montgomery-Patton rivalry is remembered today owes much to media portrayals, books. Dozens of books compare the two generals, usually favoring Patton as more exciting and quotable. Films. The 1970 film, Patton, portrayed Montgomery as pompous and ineffective, shaping public perception. Documentaries. Most English-language documentaries favor American perspectives, emphasizing Patton's achievements. Montgomery's memoirs, published his version of events but couldn't match Patton's dramatic death and legendary status. This media coverage has created a popular narrative where Patton is the hero and Montgomery the arrogant villain. This simplifies a complex reality, both were flawed brilliance. But the narrative persists because it makes good drama, the aggressive American cowboy versus the cautious British aristocrat. MacArthur's intervention fits this narrative perfectly, the wise outsider who saved the hero from the villain. Reality was more complex, but the simplified narrative has shaped how we remember the crisis. Academic historians have reassessed the Montgomery-Patton rivalry with more nuance than popular histories. Military effectiveness. Studies show both were effective in different circumstances. Montgomery excelled at set-piece battles and operational planning, Patton excelled at exploitation and pursuit. Casualty rates. Montgomery's caution did save British lives, which mattered given Britain's limited manpower. Patton's aggression did cost American lives but achieved faster results. Strategic contributions, both were essential. Montgomery's northern operations drew German forces away from Patton's sectors. Patton's speed prevented German forces from establishing new defensive lines. Alliance management, both created diplomatic problems, though in different ways. Montgomery's arrogance offended Americans, Patton's recklessness worried British planners. Academic consensus, both were brilliant, both were difficult, both contributed to victory, their rivalry was unfortunate but didn't prevent Allied success. This balanced assessment acknowledges that neither was simply right or wrong, they represented different valid approaches to warfare. Beyond military history, the Montgomery-Patton rivalry represents a personal tragedy. Two men who could have been great collaborators became bitter enemies. Imagine if they had cooperated. Montgomery's methodical planning combined with Patton's aggressive execution could have been unstoppable. Montgomery's ability to manage logistics combined with Patton's exploitation of breakthroughs could have shortened the war. Their mutual respect could have strengthened Anglo-American cooperation rather than straining it. But this never happened because neither could get past his ego. Both needed to be the star, neither could defer to the other, and the result was a rivalry that benefited no one. This is the human tragedy. Two brilliant men diminished themselves through petty competition instead of elevating each other through collaboration. MacArthur's intervention saved Patton's career but couldn't create the Montgomery-Patton partnership that might have been history's greatest command team. Churchill's private secretary recorded the Prime Minister's thoughts after deciding not to support Montgomery's demand to fire Patton. Montgomery is a great general but an insufferable man. Patton is an insufferable man but a great general. The difference is that we need generals who fight more than we need generals who complain. I cannot sacrifice alliance unity for one man's wounded pride, even if that man is Britain's most famous soldier. History will judge me for this decision. I believe it will judge me kindly. We are months from victory. Fracturing the alliance over personal rivalries now would be criminally stupid. Montgomery must accept this. If he cannot, he may resign, though I hope he won't. Patton must moderate his behavior, though I doubt he will. And I must maintain the alliance despite these two difficult prima donnas. Such is the burden of leadership in coalition warfare. These private thoughts reveal Churchill's wisdom. He understood the larger strategic picture even when it required disappointing Montgomery. George Marshall orchestrated MacArthur's intervention as part of a broader strategic vision, protecting American command authority, preventing British veto over American generals, preserved American military independence within the alliance. Managing post-war relationships, establishing that American generals couldn't be sacrificed to British political pressure, set precedents for post-war military cooperation. Preserving combat effectiveness, keeping Patton in command, maintained Third Army's aggressive operational tempo during the war's final months. Testing alliance strength, seeing if the alliance could survive serious command disputes without fracturing, helped assess post-war coalition potential. Planning for the Pacific, Marshall wanted MacArthur to develop skills in managing coalition politics, anticipating post-war occupation of Japan would require diplomatic talents. Marshall's strategic thinking operated on multiple levels simultaneously, winning the current war while preparing for post-war challenges. His management of the Montgomery-Patton crisis demonstrated this multidimensional strategic vision. After MacArthur's intervention saved his command, Patton's final months of the war were both triumphant and reflective. Military triumphs: Third Army crossed the Rhine, drove into Czechoslovakia, liberated concentration camps, and advanced faster than any other Allied army. Personal reflection: knowing he'd nearly been fired, Patton was more careful in public statements but privately contemplated his own legacy and mortality. Confronting the Holocaust, liberating concentration camps affected Patton deeply, validating his view that defeating Nazi Germany was a moral imperative. Planning post-war, Patton began thinking about occupation duties and post-war military organization. Anticipating the Soviets, Patton became increasingly concerned about Soviet intentions, views that would create new controversies. These final months showed Patton at his best militarily but also revealed his limitations politically. He remained a brilliant tactical commander but lacked the diplomatic skills necessary for post-war leadership. Montgomery's final campaigns after the crisis showed his continued effectiveness despite the political humiliation. Crossing the Rhine, Montgomery's Operation Plunder in March 1945 was a masterpiece of planning and execution. Northern Germany, 21st Army Group's advance was methodical but effective, capturing key objectives with minimal casualties. Baltic ports, Montgomery's forces secured northern German ports, preventing their use by German forces. Meeting the Soviets, Montgomery's forces linked up with Soviet armies at the Elbe River. These operations vindicated Montgomery's approach: careful planning, overwhelming preparation, minimize casualties. But they also highlighted the contrast with Patton: slower but sure. History has judged both approaches as valid for different circumstances. Montgomery's continued effectiveness after the political defeat showed professional resilience. He didn't let ego damage his military performance. Historical archives reveal unsent letters from both Montgomery and Patton during this crisis. Montgomery drafted but didn't send a resignation letter to Churchill, threatening to quit unless Patton was fired. Cooler heads prevailed. Patton drafted but didn't send an angry letter to Montgomery challenging him to personal combat to settle their differences. His staff persuaded him this was insane. Both drafted bitter letters to Eisenhower complaining about each other that they wisely didn't send. These unsent letters reveal how close the crisis came to complete breakdown. Both men were ready to escalate to career-ending levels but were pulled back by advisors and their own better judgment. The fact that these letters weren't sent shows that despite their massive egos, both Montgomery and Patton retained some strategic sense about which battles to fight and which to avoid. Modern historians debate MacArthur's motivations for intervening. Was it really about protecting Patton, or were other factors involved? Possible motivations: genuine belief in Patton's military value. MacArthur recognized Patton's effectiveness and didn't want to see it wasted. Opposition to British influence. MacArthur resented British attempts to control American generals and wanted to push back. Rivalry with Eisenhower. intervening in Eisenhower's theater allowed MacArthur to demonstrate superior political skills. Planning for post-war, MacArthur wanted to establish precedents about American military independence for coming Cold War. Personal vanity, MacArthur enjoyed being the wise elder statesman solving problems others couldn't. The truth probably involves all these factors. MacArthur was complex, capable of acting from multiple motivations simultaneously. His intervention helped Patton but also served MacArthur's broader strategic interests. This doesn't diminish its effectiveness. Complex motivations often produce the best results because they align multiple interests. Despite the Montgomery-Patton crisis, Allied unity ultimately held. Why? Several factors. War was nearly won, with victory months away. Both sides had incentives to avoid fracturing the alliance. Eisenhower's mediation, his constant diplomatic work prevented small disputes from becoming alliance-breaking crises. Roosevelt and Churchill's relationship, the political leaders' friendship and shared commitment to alliance prevented military disputes from escalating to political breaks. Common enemy, fighting Nazi Germany provided overriding purpose that transcended personality conflicts. Soviet threat, growing awareness of Soviet post-war ambitions created incentives for Anglo-American cooperation. The Montgomery-Patton crisis tested alliance unity but ultimately strengthened it by establishing limits. Neither side would sacrifice vital interests to the other's demands, but both would compromise to maintain cooperation. This realism about alliance politics served both nations well in forming NATO and managing Cold War coalition challenges. The final recorded words between Montgomery and Patton came at the Berlin Victory Celebration, June 1945, Patton, raising his glass, to our victory, achieved despite our differences. Montgomery, raising his glass, indeed. To victory, and to the men who won it. They clinked glasses but didn't speak further. Witnesses described the moment as sad, two great generals who should have been celebrating together instead maintaining cold formality. Eisenhower, watching from across the room, later wrote, "I had hoped victory would heal their rivalry. It didn't. They remained bitter to the end. A great pity. History will wonder why two such brilliant men couldn't rise above their egos." 6 months later, Patton was dead. Montgomery lived another 31 years but never spoke warmly of his rival. The last word went to Montgomery, who upon hearing of Patton's death, simply said, "A great soldier has died. The army is diminished." It was the closest Montgomery ever came to admitting he'd underestimated his rival. In his memoirs published in 1964, MacArthur briefly mentioned the Montgomery-Patton incident. During the war's final months, I was asked to offer perspective on command difficulties in Europe involving British and American generals. I wrote to Prime Minister Churchill offering my view that effective combat commanders should be protected from political persecution regardless of their difficult personalities. My advice was well received. The alliance held, the war was won, and both generals continued to serve with distinction. This episode taught me that sometimes the greatest service one can render to the nation is defending those who fight, even when they are personally difficult. Warriors deserve the support of their peers, not their censure. This sanitized version omits the drama and personal animosities but captures MacArthur's essential point: protect those who produce results. The passage reveals MacArthur's self-image as wise statesman solving problems through diplomatic intervention rather than the controversial figure he often was. What if MacArthur hadn't intervened? Scenario 1: Eisenhower fires Patton. Third Army continues under new command. Patton becomes a martyr figure. Anglo-American relations suffer. The war ends slightly later. Post-war recriminations about British interference in American command poison NATO formation. Scenario 2: Eisenhower keeps Patton despite British pressure. Montgomery resigns in protest. Churchill must choose between supporting Montgomery or maintaining alliance. Political crisis ensues but eventually resolves. War continues with both generals in command but alliance strained. Scenario 3: Roosevelt intervenes directly, overruling British demands. Major diplomatic incident between Washington and London. War effort continues but political cooperation damaged. Post-war relationship starts on bad footing. MacArthur's actual intervention provided a path between these extremes. Patton stayed in command, Montgomery backed down without resigning, Churchill could frame it as his own decision, and the alliance held. It was the best of imperfect outcomes. The Montgomery-Patton crisis reveals psychological truths about leadership, confidence versus arrogance. Both men were supremely confident, essential for command. But that confidence crossed into arrogance that made them difficult to manage. Need for validation, both required constant recognition and couldn't tolerate being upstaged, revealing deep insecurity beneath surface confidence. Zero-sum thinking, both saw the other's success as diminishing their own, rather than recognizing how their different strengths could complement each other. Professional jealousy, both measured themselves against the other rather than against the mission's requirements. Inability to subordinate ego, neither could put alliance needs above personal pride, requiring superiors to manage their conflicts. These psychological patterns are common among high-achieving leaders and explain why brilliant individuals often struggle to work together. Understanding these patterns doesn't excuse the behavior but helps explain why managing talented, difficult subordinates remains a timeless leadership challenge. What lessons does the Montgomery-Patton crisis offer modern military coalitions? Establish clear command structures. Ambiguity about authority breeds conflict. Modern coalitions need explicit chains of command. Build personal relationships early. NATO commanders meet regularly in peacetime specifically to prevent the kind of personal animosities that plagued Montgomery and Patton. Create conflict resolution mechanisms. Modern coalitions have established procedures for resolving disputes before they escalate. Accept national differences. Different military cultures have different approaches. Neither is wrong, just different. Value multiple approaches. Having both cautious and aggressive commanders provides operational flexibility. Protect alliance cohesion. No individual, however talented, is more important than coalition unity. Separate difficult personalities. When commanders can't work together, assign them to different sectors. Modern NATO operations apply these lessons, preventing personality conflicts from threatening mission success. The Montgomery-Patton crisis provided painful lessons that improved how democratic nations conduct coalition warfare. MacArthur's letter to Churchill was only 800 words, but those words changed the course of events. They saved Patton's command, allowing Third Army to complete its spectacular final campaign. They protected American command authority from British political pressure. They preserved alliance unity at a critical moment. They established precedents for managing coalition disputes in NATO. They demonstrated that diplomatic skill matters as much as tactical brilliance. The Montgomery-Patton crisis showed that wars are won not just on battlefields but in headquarters, through letters, diplomacy, and political skill. MacArthur's intervention was a strategic masterpiece, identifying the real issue, alliance cohesion versus one general's ego, crafting arguments that appealed to Churchill's interests, and providing political cover for the right decision. When Montgomery demanded Patton's head, everyone expected a crisis that would fracture the alliance. MacArthur's reply shocked everyone because it was unexpected, effective, and ultimately wise. He didn't defend Patton by attacking Montgomery directly. He defended Patton by asking Churchill to consider what mattered more, winning the war or satisfying Montgomery's wounded pride. Churchill chose correctly. The alliance held. The war was won. And history remembers MacArthur's intervention as a model of how to resolve coalition conflicts through wisdom, diplomacy, and strategic thinking.